Today we're going to have a look at how to light low-key portraits in Unreal using the UltraLight. You can see from the examples here, I've done 3 using metahumans from Unreal Engine. Those are freely available. You can download them using the Quixel Bridge plugin that's built into Unreal Engine 5. The UltraLight is available on the Epic Marketplace. If you want to follow along, you'll need to grab that first. But I think there's lots of value here for people who just want to learn a little bit more about CG lighting in general. So let's jump over to Unreal and have a look at how these portraits were put together. If you have a look at the overview, you can see there are 4 lights in the scene. The one light that is a little hard to see here, let me just zoom in on that, is the catch light. Because that is facing the subject and not the camera, and it's by default set up to be a single-sided light, you can't necessarily see it. This is a case where activating the back face visibility can be useful to help you see where light is in the scene. Sometimes it gets in the way, and if I'm trying to position other lights, you can see the camera's in my way and that light's in the way. It can be problematic, but for now, as we're just sort of having an overview, it's helpful to turn that on. Other than that, we have a large top light. And let's actually just turn them all off, and we can activate them one at a time. So the large top light is just a bit of fill. As you can see, it's not doing very much at all. The backlight, the key light, and we're going to spend a bit of time talking about that one in a moment. And then the catch light. That one is doing a lot, but in a subtle way. And it's kind of a key thing with high-end professional lighting. It's the little things that make all the difference in the world. So you can see it's mostly for the catch light in the eyes, but it's also giving us a little bit of fill. So looking at this, and again, I'm just blown away at the quality of these metahumans. This is straight out of the box. Like I said, just a little bit of posing done on this, and that's about it. They're mind-blowingly good. So the the key light right now is set up as a straightforward box. Very little has been changed to it. It's using a natural shape, box 2, so it's got a bit of undulation there, and that just shows up a little bit in the highlights in the eyes and the reflections that you see. It's a subtle thing, but not huge. The thing I wanted to talk about with using the UltraLight versus a rect light, so I have a rect light in here in the same position, and you get a very similar result. This one's been tuned a little bit, and the rect light can be replicated exactly with the UltraLight by simply turning off the light plane and then by activating the specular component on the rect light, which is built into it. That by default is turned off there, so that the specular is coming entirely from the light plane, but you can mix and match those a little bit. The thing with the rect light, though, is the components the key components are the reflection and the cast illumination, and you have very minimal control over them as separate elements when you're using a rect light. You can take the specular component down, but you cannot increase it beyond 1. So if I set that to 0, that's just what the light's doing. That's your specular component. If we look at the UltraLight, we can see that a little simpler because we have the rect light there and the specular component coming from the light plane. So when you're dealing with many subjects, including human skin, which may not be super obvious to some, is that the reflection is just as important as the light itself, sometimes more so. Both are important, particularly with CG elements where you're dealing with things like subsurface scattering and indirect illumination and all kinds of factors that are affected by the light separate from the reflection. So it's important to have both. But the nice thing is that you can control the amount of illumination and the effect on the skin separately, very simply this way. So right now you see if I take the light plane down, we can play with the intensity of the light plane and control the strength of that reflection on the skin, but we're not really increasing the amount of light that's filling in all the shadows. So if I do the same thing with the rect light and take that intensity up to try to get even close, you can see it's causing a lot more brightness in the shot in general and blowing out a lot faster. Whereas here I can get a lot more subtle control over that amount of illumination on the skin before I start running into trouble. And if I want to, I can take the rect light intensity down even a bit more. So you get quite a bit of control and a lot more subtlety. I think that reflection's a little bit hot. And then if you're happy with the ratio of the reflection and the light, you can use the master intensity override to control the brightness of the whole thing together. I'm going to leave that at 1 for now. Let's just jump over to the camera view. We'll maximize that to see it a little bit better. So I think the light position is in a relatively good spot. I've spent a bit of time playing around with that. There's no right or wrong. This is just a question of personal preference and style and the look that you're trying to go for. The main thing that I want to talk about here is controlling the shape of the light. So right now, the quality of the light is looking pretty good to me. I like the fall off on his face. I'm still holding detail in the highlights, but I'm looking at the reflection in the eye, and there's a pretty hard line in there, and that's sort of classic CG lights. If I go back to the rect light for a moment and look at that, let's take that down to a more reasonable number. Again, I'm going to have to zoom in so I don't break my camera here. If we look at the reflection in the eye, that perfectly square, perfectly even light is a hallmark of CGI lighting. Looking at the skin looks pretty good, but the catch light in the eye to me doesn't look amazing. Having the UltraLight in play instead allows us to use some of the gradient tools that are built into that to shape that light a little bit more. It's going to shape the light on the face and on the reflection. So there's a little bit of a radial gradient happening now. We can bring in a little bit more. You can see now how that highlight's starting to get a bit more shape in it. Now the overall intensity could come up a little bit. Now we have to be careful about this. I just did the master intensity override. What we're bumping up here is the overall brightness of both, but you have to recognize that the radial gradient that's being applied to the light plane does not affect the rect light that's in behind it. I'll show you what I mean by that. Let's grab that light. So if I just take that intensity back down, let's even take it lower so we can really see it. You can see it in the viewport better here now where the gradient's coming in. So it's shaping the reflection, but the light is coming straight through that because this isn't casting any shadows. It's just for creating the reflections. So if I bump that back up to 1 and I want to brighten up the whole thing, I will brighten up both by using the master intensity. And that's not necessarily what I want to do. What I want to create is a brighter reflection, but not necessarily add to the rect light's intensity to get us back into that world. Maybe I'll set that up to 18 or 19. Yeah. So now we have a little bit more shape in the face. It's actually controlling the highlight a little bit better, and the reflection in the eye, that little specular of the light source, I think looks a lot better. And again, it's small, it's subtle, but these are the kind of things that make all the difference when you're trying for that last 2, 3, 4% to get you from CG into realism. So this light is like I said, pretty straightforward. There's lots more we could do with it, but I think as a default simple box setup, it looks pretty good. Jump over to the backlight. So the backlight I've added with a contrasting color, so I've got a bit of a cool fill happening there, and it's just bringing out a little bit of detail in the shoulder and the hair, just enough to create some separation. And that was almost enough for me, but I thought just a tiny little bit of fill from the top light helped, just to bring out a bit more detail in the face. Pretty subtle. It's also set to be fairly cool. Let me jump back. Because it is fairly low intensity, it's not adding a ton of light. It's the reflection. The light plane is doing very little in this case because it's so far away. It's not really reflecting any of the surfaces that are visible to camera. That could actually even be turned off and you really wouldn't see any difference. It's all about the rect light in this case. I have it on there mostly because it helps me visually to remember the light and what it's doing and give me a feel for what it's looking like. But the rectangle light intensity is what's controlling that. Again, it's doing very little, but if I turn it off, as we saw before, it gets pretty dark in there, and I wanted just that little bit of extra detail. The one thing that was really missing from this one to my eye was the catch lights. The eyes felt a little bit dead. I wanted to bring something around there, but I didn't want to bring the main light around and change the shape of the light. So I wanted to add a catch light reflector into the eyes. I'll let that resolve for a moment. And that to me is a huge difference in how live the portrait feels. The catch lights themselves are created with straightforward UltraLight. I'm using the octagonal shape box just to create a more interesting shape. In this case, I'm using a texture as a way to get some more interesting shape in the reflections in the eyes. Look at the texture parameters there. You can see I'm using an interesting parabolic reflector. If we have a look at that, these textures are from the Diffuse 3D collection of professionally shot HDRI light sources. These are just a handful I grabbed because I thought they'd create more interesting catch light reflections, but the set themselves is quite extensive. They are all fully HDRI with quite a range. I believe it's 10 stops of dynamic range on all of them. So these are a fantastic resource. The link for these is down below. I can highly recommend using those. Though, the idea behind the UltraLight is that you don't need to rely on textures exclusively. They certainly are a great building block, and then being able to customize on top of them is sort of the best combination of both. In this case, I've chosen to use this parabolic reflector because I think it created some interesting catch lights. And if we have a look at that up close, just hop out in the light for a moment, or in the camera, I should say, and zoom in there. So if we just turn off the texture, you can see the light source itself does create a bit of a shape. It is interesting to have at least something in there, but similar to the conversation about the, let me just turn this one off too. The main light's reflection in the eye, that's sort of CG classic, flat, no detailed reflection is extremely limiting. So by adding the texture, we create a lot more realistic, a lot more interesting little catch lights, a lot more subtle detail in there. The one thing that I noticed just in this case, I wanted the catch lights to be bright, but not too bright. But I didn't want to illuminate the entire thing too far. So for example, if I take the master intensity up to something like 3, I can make them brighter, but then they become a bit too strong. And it's also starting to create some more fill on the front of the face, which I didn't like. So what I opted to do instead was use one of the radio gradients, and I set that to a negative, and it's an inverted radio. That's creating a little hotspot light. So you can see right there, it creates that little bright speck of interest without overpowering the light as a whole. So again, off and on. If we jump out of the camera view, you can see what's happening there on the light itself. Yeah, if we take that radio gradient, turn it off, and there. It can be a bit deceptive. What you're seeing here in the viewport is not necessarily representing what you're seeing through the cinema camera with exposure factored in. So it's less obvious here than I think it is here, but still very much an advantage, but still a nice little detail add. So if we return to the camera view, and look at everything all together again. So what you end up with is a very sophisticated and yet subtle lighting setup that works great for, the metahumans or any other character that you'd want to try. It really comes down to the little subtle tweaks and changes that you can make to a light source that take it from okay, but very CG looking to highly realistic and much more crafted and professional looking lighting setups. I think this is a good example of what can be done with characters. Obviously, it's a simple and low-key setup, and there's lots of different options. We'll have a look at another example in just a moment. In this second example, you can see I'm using a different metahuman, also straight out of the box, just a little bit of a pose done. And starting with the same basic lighting setup, it's been modified a little bit, which we can look at in just a moment. You can see there's a key light, fill light, back edge, rim light, a bit of top fill, and then the catch light thing is happening here on this one as well. So if we hop out and see, you'll see one of the big differences is the size of the catch light reflector, and I'm using a gobo here to help control the light that's casting on the face. But if we look at the light here without the gobo, You can see that the large reflection that I wanted to create in the eyes and the brightness that I wanted to create in her eyes in this one was also creating a lot of light on her face. So in order to get the best of both worlds, I used the gobo to cut down the cast illumination that's hitting her face. And again, it's not from the actual light. You can see the light is off. It's indirect illumination happening because of the self-illuminated plane. There are a few ways you could get around this. I could also pull this probably quite a bit further back and make it even bigger and get a similar looking reflection without being close enough to cast any light, but the gobo worked fine in this case. And the main light is a very similar setup as last time. In fact, if we just look at showing the modified parameters, you can see compared to a stock ultralight, very little has actually been done. It's very straightforward, very simple three light setup, 4 if you count the catch light, more of a reflector than a light. But lots can be done with very little. And again, it's about the subtle gradations in the light and the careful placement of them in combination gives you just that really nice crafted lighting feeling for a professional portrait. So there's 2 that I've done already. Let's grab a third metahuman character and start from scratch. So we have a third metahuman downloaded and added in. This is Chandra, right off the Quixel Bridge download. No modifications to the model itself. Just some quick posing done to set up an expression, just a place to start. And I had just added a directional light just so I could see what I was doing while I was doing some of that posing. But now that we have him in place, let's grab all of our lights and delete them, and we'll start again. Let's go to the UltraLight folder, grab an UltraLight, bring it into the scene. Turn on the rect light so we have a bit of fill. For now, this is just going to be something we can use to see what we're doing as we figure out the rest of the shot. But eventually that will become our top fill. Right now we're having a little trouble seeing what's going on because of the set. I'll just hide that for the time being. I want this to be a fairly big soft light. We actually don't need the light plane. We discussed this on the previous setup. It's there mostly just as a visual cue, but we don't actually need it, but I'm going to leave it on for now. Let's go to our base color. Give that just a slightly cool tone. And we'll cut that intensity down. You'll notice that there's a lot of flickering happening with the path tracer. I'm finding this is a thing with all of the metahumans. I have a feeling it has to do with this physics simulation. I'm not entirely sure, but you will notice that they do start to flicker at times. Sometimes it settles down. Sometimes the only way to get rid of it is to save the file and reopen it, which I'm going to do right now to see if we can minimize that. Go to the UltraLight Blueprints folder, drag out another one. One of the joys of positioning items in Unreal. Random placement in the world space. Just zero this out. Faster. Bring that around. So while I work on this side, I am going to turn off the top light so we can get a better sense of what's happening. I like to light one light at a time. It's also pretty important to light from the camera position. So we'll just widen this out so we can have a look at our parameters a little bit better. We are going to use the rec light. Now I'm just walking it back slowly and watching it as it passes through. And I'm looking at the shape of the light on its face and just kind of seeing where I like that. Keep it in keeping with the other shots, so we'll keep it fairly side lit. Come a little bit higher. I think we're starting to get somewhere there. I think I'd like to see a stronger specular component. We turn that off for a sec. We're not really getting a lot of it's coming from the light, the area light. The specular component is pretty subtle. I think giving a little more glow on the skin works a bit better. Let's maximize this so we can see it better. Give that a moment. Feels pretty good as a starting point. I think the light, as we've talked about with the first shot, we've got that hard CG looking specular. So let's add some detail to this light. Put a radial blur on. Radial gradient, I should say. I do like to see the light when I'm working on them. Find it more intuitive. Or drive that a little bit to make it more visible. I think we can bring the master intensity back up. And I will use the master intensity so I can maintain the ratio between the light plane and the rect light as I have it. Give that a moment to resolve. Yeah. Again, we're getting more of a realistic looking specular in the eyes there. I think the light plane intensity could come up just a bit higher. And maybe we'll bring the rect light down a bit. Nice. Save that. Let's hop out and add another light. So for speed, I'm just going to duplicate this one. Let's push this one in behind. We'll make this our backlight. Let's actually get into the habit of naming our lights. I think this one will make quite a bit cooler, like I did with the previous ones. Base color here. Bring the intensity down quite a bit. Not too bad as a starting point. Let's crank it up even more. I like what it's doing to his hair in this one. Sometimes getting that nice angle means bringing the light into frame. We can see that's doing some nice things here, getting a little bit intense there, but once it's in place, we can just back it off and then scale it up and maintain that light quality, but keeping it out of frame. Let's give that a sec. Yeah, pretty good. I think, again, I would like to see some more interest in the eyes, so we'll bring back our catch light. And that we'll grab a brand new one. So we can see that's doing quite a bit, and the shape is very obviously a box. So like the other ones, I'll choose one of the more interesting shapes as a starting point. Probably scale it down quite a bit. And again, it's very flat, so I'll use the same texture that I was using with the other two. Let's filter down to the texture section. And again, we can grab the diffuse 3D texture. Link for these again is below. And while I think that definitely goes a long way, I think it could still use a bit more interest. Let's play around with the contrast and brightness of this texture itself. Not too bad, but I do think it could use a little more sparkle. So I'm going to add that same radial gradient hotspot back in like I did on the first one. So let's set that to 1 and invert it. Actually, so that needs to be -1. Let's make it more obvious so we can see what we're doing. I think it was around -10 on the last one. There we are. I'll just scale it right down quite a bit. That might be too far. And I'm just watching that little hot spot in the middle. Pretty good. You see it's doing quite a bit to his face. Quite a lot of fill, getting that brightness that I like in there. See if we can tone the whole thing down a little bit now that we have the hot spot in there. Yeah, that's better. Go back to the radial spot. Maybe make that a little bit more intense. And name this one. Give that a sec to resolve. Just flip back on the set walls there. Give it a moment to resolve again, just to have a look at that. There's a slight difference in what we're seeing in the background. I think just a little bit of fill bouncing off those walls, just a tiny bit. But I do think it is better with the walls in. Let's do a high-res render of this and have a look at the final result. So here's that first render. So to me, this looks quite a bit overlit. It's a bit deceptive when you think about how that looked in the viewport and how much fill light we're actually seeing. So back over in Unreal, have a look at it. You can kind of see that overlighting here, I think. I think it's a combination of the catch light, which we're going to take down to half the power. And I think that top light is actually still doing quite a bit too much. So let's cut that in half, maybe even quarter. Let's have a quick look at what that's doing all by itself. Yeah, that actually is still doing quite a bit, even at a quarter of the power. Cut it down even further. There we go. I think that's going to help a lot. Yeah, that feels better. Let's try another render here. I think this looks quite a bit better if we just toggle back and forth between the current and the previous one. Huge difference. So as you can see, it's pretty straightforward to get quite a nice, realistic, and well-crafted lighting setup using the UltraLight with very, very little effort. Obviously, we could spend lots of time and make all different kinds of lighting arrangements in here, but to me, this looks pretty good, and I think it's in keeping with the other two. Let's just quickly pull up the other ones beside it and have a look. So here are the three of them together. Looking at it now, I'm kind of feeling like possibly this one is just a little bit too hot. So I might go back and knock back this main light a little bit. And actually, I think with hers, we could bring it up a little bit just to get the ratio between the key light and the fill light or the backlight more in the same world on these. So let's have a quick look at those. So let's grab his key light. Right now, the light plane intensity is pretty high, and the rect light level is actually pretty low. So we'll just adjust the master intensity. I think taking a half a stop off of it, and the stop would be 50%, so around 0.9. So if we go 1.4, we should be roughly half a stop, something in that world anyway. Yeah, I think that looks pretty good. Let's render that one. So here's the newest render in place. I think these ones are looking a lot better. And this one is looking pretty good too. I just think this one, picture of Peyton here, could use just a bit more snap in the highlight side. So I'm going to jump back over to that file and we'll tweak the lighting on her. Back in the Peyton file. So yeah, it does feel a little flatter. I think let's just turn off all of our lights again and do that same process. Start with our key light and the backlight. And there, the ratio is feeling actually pretty good on this one. I think the key light is a little bit on the weak side. Let's try bumping that up a half a stop. Our top light, maybe the top light's a little strong on this one too. Yeah, just a little bit. So let's take that down a bit. Let's see what that catch light's doing. So even with the gobo, that catch light's still creating quite a bit of flat fill on her face. So let's cut that down quite a bit. Here we go. Let's cut that one in half. I think that's better. And maybe we'll just go over to the radial gradient that's creating the extra hotspot for us there. Make that quite a bit brighter, but maybe we'll make it just a little bit smaller. I'm going to tone down the outer gradient that's darkening it a bit. It's probably a little hard to see what's going on, so let's have a look at that catch light where we can actually see it, get a feel for what it's doing here. So as you can see, it's quite big and doing quite a lot to her face. So maybe we can try and find a better spot for that. And maybe we can adjust that gobo even further. Let's maximize that again, have a quick look. That might be okay. Let's try it with the other lights on and see what we get. Probably still just a little bit too bright, but not bad. Let's just take it down just a tiny bit. Back to the main light. Let's try that. Let's give that a render and see what we get. I feel like it's gone just a little bit too far, so I think we'll go back and pop that light up just a little bit again. Not too far, like I said, so let's try with the new position. Maybe there. Give that a go. There we are. I think these two are now feeling pretty good. Now I think our last one, Chandler's, just got a little bit too much fill. We'll knock that one back, match the other two, and then I think we'll be done. One more render for him, and that should be it. So yeah, I think it's going to come down to the combination of the top light and the catch light. Take that top light down even further. And the catch light can come down a little bit as well. Somewhere around there. Obviously, if one was trying to create a perfectly matched set of portraits, you would keep the lighting setup consistent and not change it from character to character. In this case, we recreated the lighting, so it's going to be different. It makes it a little bit more challenging, but still, it's just a matter of finessing a few variables and we can get everything back into the same zone. Let's render this one off and compare the final three. And here we are with the final set. I think these three sit really nicely together. Yeah, I'm happy. So there you go. It's a pretty straightforward process. Lighting portraits is no different than lighting anything else. It's really a lot about taking your time and sort of having a sense of where light needs to be. Let me just pop out of this camera so we can move again. It's a simple setup, 3 lights, not a lot required, but even though you don't really see it in the viewport, the subtle gradients that have been added to these lights do help shape the light into a much more sophisticated sculpt of light on the subject and gives everything just a bit more of a polished feel. Just before I wrap this up, I wanted to come back and look at one more thing that I noticed when I was looking at these images. If we have a look at Hudson, the first one, this one I'd set up a really nice depth of field, I think, and a little bit of fall off towards the edge of the face and the hair. But if we look at Peyton, see that one is pretty sharp. And same thing with Chandra. We pop him open and look at these enlarged. You'll see these ones are quite a bit sharper, and I wasn't as happy with that. So I decided to have another look at the camera settings on those two shots. So let's jump back over to Unreal and I'll show you those changes. So back in Unreal, the original renders were done at an aperture of f22, I believe. And the focal plane was set here at the front eye, which is a fairly common place in photography or in portraiture to set up your focal plane somewhere near that camera near eye. But at 22, it was pretty sharp all the way out. So if we jump for a moment back over to Bridge, you can see the variations that I ran through here. That was our render at f22. I'll just enlarge that. Then I tried it at 2.8, and you can see that's quite soft, probably a little too soft. That back eye is a little too out of focus. So I tried 5.6. That one was better. Feels pretty natural, but maybe just a little sharp. So the final render there at f4 is the one I settled on. I was pretty happy with that. And again, I did the same thing with Peyton. I ran through the same tests and netted out with the same basic setup at f4 here. Again, that was just a fairly minor change, but I think overall it makes a big difference. And if we look at those final three as a set again, they sit very nicely together and have a much more natural feel with just that little tweak. So again, thank you very much for your time and your interest. I hope you learned a little bit about portrait lighting in CG, Unreal in particular, and in particular how to do it with the UltraLight. It's a tool that makes these sorts of things quite a bit easier. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below, or any thoughts for future videos. I'm very much open to your interests. You can also reach out on the Discord channel. I'm always there to support customers and to answer questions about CG lighting in general. Thanks again, and have fun lighting your own projects.